I just wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for coming to this event, a conversation on child marriage. And I also wanted to give a warm welcome to our guest speaker, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who without her, this event wouldn't have been possible. So thank you so much for joining us today, Ayaan. Now, for those of you who don't know my name is Ariana Richter, and I am a senior at FSU. I am a double major. I am an international affairs and Middle Eastern studies major with a concentration in human rights. My advocacy for child marriage began when I joined the AHA Foundation as a research fellow and met a woman named Frady Reese. It was through this foundation that I became aware how prevalent this practice was here in the United States. Now, our speaker today, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, is a research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Her journey began in Somalia in 1969, where as a young girl, she was subjected to female genital mutilation. From early on, she questioned the physical and mental subjugation of women all around her. The AHA Foundation protects women from honor violence, forced marriage, and genital mutilation. Now, for Ayaan, the subject of forced and child marriage is personal. While residing in Kenya, her father arranged for her to marry a man she never met. His name was Osman. He was 27 years old, and he was a distant cousin. Soon after, Ayaan fled to Holland, where she claimed political asylum. Once there, she worked her way up from being a janitor to serving as an elected member of the Dutch parliament. She was 22 years old and had the self-confidence to flee the Netherlands to escape her future with Osman. Now, Ayaan wondered what it would have been like if she had been 15 years of age or younger and did not have the wherewithal or determination to flee. Would she instead be powerless, fulfilling Osman's wishes of having 6 children? Ayaan has shown great courage, risking her life to expose the violence she sees around her. But she has done more than speak out. Ayaan has connected her life experiences and the attention she garnered to the AHA Foundation. She took action to protect women and girls from the violence she and many others faced, including child marriage. Now, while Ayaan's story may sound exotic, forced and child unions do not only occur in these faraway countries, they are happening in the West today. Although the United States Department of State recognizes all marriage before 18 as a human rights abuse and condemns compulsory marriage in the rest of the world, child marriage is widespread and is still legal in 44 states. Between 2000 and 2010, an estimated of 250,000 children, as young as 12, were married in the United States. 44 states are failing to protect girls from this dangerous practice. Dangerous loopholes and exceptions exist that allow for early marriage. Some even have no minimum age. Common legal loopholes that allow for this practice include parental consent, judicial consent, and an exception allowing for marriage in the case of pregnancy. The AHA Foundation advocates for a hard minimum age of marriage at the age of majority in each state, with no exception. Early marriages increase girls' risks of experiencing violence and can easily be forced unions. Women who are wed below the age of majority are vulnerable to physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. Due to their minority status, they do not have the freedoms to exercise the law as adults. This includes a minor being turned away to domestic violence shelter and the inability to file for divorce. So perhaps at the end of this event, we can all conclude together that what is needed is a shift in terminology to reflect what's really happening when a family offers up their 12-year-old daughter to a 27-year-old distant cousin. As Ayaan has stated, we need to call child marriages what they are, slavery. Now, before Ayaan takes her questions, I would like to give Ayaan a moment to introduce herself.
Ariana, thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. I think actually you've covered everything. I'm going to have difficulty trying to say more than that. I think that child marriage is a form of slavery. When you're a minor before you're the age of 18, you're not mature enough to enter into a legal contract that states that you're going to spend this person, in many cases whom you've never met, that you're going to spend the rest of your life with someone you've never met before, that you're going to have children with someone you've never met before, that you're going to establish a home and a future with a person you've never met before. And I think we talk a lot about slavery and events that took place 200 years ago, but child marriage or forcing children into this type of thing, and about 98% of these forced marriages happen to girls. that is a form of modern day slavery, and there is no, I can't think of any other language to define that. Sometimes the marriage is sold to the child as inevitable. You know, you've come of age, you now have your period, your body is transitioning from that of a child to a woman. So it's time for you to get married because you know what? That's what your mother did. That's what your grandmother did. That's what your sisters did. And the child is given no choice in the matter. It's presented as, this is tradition. This is just our religion, and you have no choice in this. And sometimes it's actually forced with physical force, where girls are beaten into submission and they are told either you die or you enter into this marriage. And in both cases, one might be softer than the other, but it is coercion. It's an individual who's not yet mature enough, who's not of age, being forced into a situation that is often a lifelong prison, and that they can't get out of, where unwanted pregnancies occur. Any kind of sexual activity that takes place in that marriage is clearly rape. And I've spoken to many, many victims of child marriage, and that's exactly how they describe it. They don't have the opportunity to say no. And that the law is very clear in developed countries that protect women, that sex without consent is rape. And that happens when you subject that child that later on becomes an adult to a lifelong of being held captive by someone she would never have chosen if she had the opportunity. So I welcome your thoughts, and I welcome your comments, and I welcome your questions.
So child marriage, as you stated, it is a universal phenomenon, but can you please discuss the differences between child marriage in the US, a developed country, as opposed to countries that are developing and in the third world?
Well, I think first and foremost, child marriage in the US is illegal. It's against the law. Now, as you said earlier, not all states actually uphold the law, and many states do have these loopholes: the parental consent, the judicial consent, the pregnancy exception, and people take advantage of these loopholes. Families take advantage of these loopholes. It's also very clear that the United States Department of State recognizes all marriages before 18 as a human rights abuse, but on the other hand, the same states, United States Department and state departments, it allows for a minor here in the United States to import, or the parents of the minor to sponsor non-citizens from other countries to come into the United States based on a marriage certificate or on marriage that is to a minor. So I think it's paradoxical that on the one hand, child marriage is outlawed, and that the United States government puts a lot of effort into campaigning against child marriage in the developing world. But on the other hand, on the state level, we have these loopholes, and we allow a minor to petition for the United States government to petition for marriage a non-citizen. Now, you go to countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, lots and lots of countries, age of marriage is said to be allowed from the time that the girl gets her period, and it's actually really left to the discretion of the family. And there may be laws in the books in some North African countries that say marriage is not allowed until the child is 18, but no one enforces that. So it's really left to the discretion of the parents. These are, I think, the key differences is that in many of these countries, it's legal, it's traditional, it's accepted, whereas in the US, it's illegal. And the families that do pressure their children to marry, they do that clandestinely.
Right. No, thank you so much for sharing, and thank you for coming. And now we're going to go to panelist Hannah Noor, and she's going to ask a question.
Hi, Ayaan. My name is Hannah. To give you a little brief introduction, I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Central Florida, and I have a couple of questions for you. So the first question is, child marriage has oftentimes been described as a symptom and a solution to factors impacting a young girl's life. For example, the one less mouth to feed fallacy. What factors do you think can contribute to this harmful practice?
Well, the one mouth less to feed, if you allowed this child to actually go to school, she would be feeding herself. She would finish her higher education, she would find a job, maybe even found a small business, join an existing business, and she would have the capacity not only to feed herself, but also probably to feed her own children and maybe even contribute to the family income. So I do think that that's a fallacy, and that denying children, especially girls, their education is what keeps this cycle of poverty going. Another argument that I hear a lot is, well, it's God said so. You know, the Prophet Muhammad was said to have married his wife Aisha when she was 9 years old. And if we follow in that example, then it's moral and it's acceptable and it's a good thing to marry off your children, your daughters, at such an early age as 9, 10, 11. In Yemen, I've even seen cases of 8. There are families in some of the Middle Eastern societies that promise a boy and a girl to one another at birth. And it depends on when the marriage ceremony takes place. Very often it is before they're 18, and for the girls especially, but it happens as early as that. And I've also had arguments of tradition. This is just how we do things. You know, they say my grandmother was married off when she was 13 years old. So she doesn't see anything wrong in marrying off a 13-year-old girl. She doesn't see that a 13-year-old, 14-year-old is not old enough in the modern world to look after herself, to look after children, that physically her body isn't developed enough to carry through a pregnancy. And in Africa and in the Middle East, we see that a lot of mother mortality has to do with girls who are too young to be of childbearing age, forced into a situation where they get pregnant and can't carry that through, and the child dies and the mother dies, and it's just terrible. I've also had arguments about, you know, we have nothing to eat, we are so poor, so, you know, we might as well, if this man is going to pay a lot of money to accept this underage daughter as his wife, then the family gets to eat, and that is literally selling your child. We're seeing after the withdrawal in Afghanistan, many cases of that in Afghanistan, where parents with tears in their eyes and a broken heart are literally selling their children just so that they can have food. So it is, yes, it's a child marriage is a product of poverty and cycles of poverty, and just really a terrible understanding of what it is that it takes to break through these cycles of poverty, and then it's otherwise justified in the name of religion and tradition.
Thank you for that explanation, Ayaan. I just have one more question for you. Now, the second question is, what challenges exist in ensuring the effectiveness of international legal documents or state laws that prohibit child marriage?
Enforcement. I think that it's good to have all of these laws on paper, but as long as there are loopholes and as long as there are contradictions, as long as there are no resources to enforce these laws, and as long as you don't have a brigade of people that are really actually going after these crimes and enforcing them, then it just all remains aspirational and good intentions.
Thank you, Ayaan.
Thank you, Hannah. Now we're going to hear from panelist Mariel Patrick.
Hi, just a little bit about me. I'm a senior at FSU studying interdisciplinary medical sciences. And so I have a question to follow up on what you said about the cycle of poverty and how that's due to tradition. What do you think we can do to almost change these views on child marriage? Because if it is due to tradition and, oh, this is just what you do, what can we do rather than government enforcement, more on a local level to change these perspectives and have more of an impact in our own community?
So I think number one, it's awareness, right? There are a lot of Americans, a lot of people who live in the West who think that child marriage is something that happens in faraway countries, very remote, it's exotic, or it's something that used to happen in the past and that doesn't happen anymore. Very few people are actually aware of the fact that young children are forced into marriage. So awareness. Very few human rights institutions, even like women's shelters and child protection agencies, are unaware of the fact that child marriage occurs here in the United States. So I would say a great deal of it is campaigning for awareness. I think it's also campaigning for women's rights, girls and women's rights. If you send your girls to school, they will be able to feed themselves and potentially contribute to the family financially. And I think that with tradition and with religion, when you hear those arguments, part of it is, yes, this is how we've always done things and we just need to continue doing it that way. And people are not aware of the unintended consequences, unintended negative consequences of these traditions and religious edicts. On the other hand, I think there is a fear that, and this is a deep-seated fear, you see it not only among Muslims, but among Jewish communities and other religious communities, Hindus and so on, that a young woman will bring shame upon the family and upon herself. And it's just a way really of controlling young girls' sexuality, just have them protected within the context of a marriage, and that way no illicit sexual activities can take place. That's a big one. And that denies, basically, it's just a concept that denies girls and women the right to own their own bodies, their own sexuality, and choose who they want to spend the rest of their lives with. So I think in terms of awareness, teaching, and then there is the law. If it's illegal to marry of children in the United States, then it should be enforced. Get rid of the loopholes and provide the resources for enforcing those laws.
Thank you so much.
Now we're going to hear from panelist Cody Bias.
Hello, I'm a senior at Florida State University, and I'm studying economics and political science. And my first question, so child marriage is categorized as a gender-based violence, so it much more disproportionately affects women and girls than men and young boys. And I was wondering if you could just explain why that is.
I think that it has to do with the history in traditional, really it's human history that girls and women are seen as the weaker sex. So in the past and still in many societies today, young boys and men are trained to be focused on the outside of the house, to fight, to work, to earn money, to travel. And by the time a young man has done all of that, he has reached an age of maturity. And very often it's taken for granted that a young man will choose who he wants to marry, or in any case, from what family. Girls are sheltered, they're protected as the weaker sex. And in many of these traditions, girls are seen as property, unfortunately. And so when you give a girl away as a bride, the family, in many cases, gets money. Now, I know in India, it's a different case, but still, the woman is seen as a source of shame, again, an extra mouth to feed. And if you put all of these things together, then the family sees it, and especially the father or the guardian, the male guardian, sees it as his responsibility to ensure that a young woman a girl is married off for her own sake, for her own protection, for the family honor. And I think that's why girls are affected way more than boys and men.
Thank you. And my second question was, have you seen any programs that have been started in developing and third world countries that have been effective in keeping girls in school until they're 18 and keeping them unwed until they're age 18 or older?
Yes. And I think most of those programs are programs that focus on persuading parents and societies to allow girls to go to school and finish school. And the longer you are in school as a young woman, the likelier that you will get to an age that, you know, you finish high school when you're 18. And depending on how persuasive these programs are, I think what you're seeing in developing countries, but also in the Middle East, Muslim majority countries, is that more and more families are choosing to send their kids to school, and there are more and more opportunities available to young girls and women to attend school. Now, that is in societies where there is some kind of existing governmental order. My experience is in Somalia in the 1960s and the 1970s, the number of child marriages had gone down and families were choosing to send their kids to school, their girls to school, and keep them at school. And then in the 1990s, when the order completely broke down, that is when a lot of families started to revert back to child marriage, because it wasn't safe to have a girl in the house, because it was tradition, because people had become more religious, and because of the fallacy of an extra mouth to feed. So where order is broken down, where there is no government order, where there is no rule of law, where there is civil war, you see just a plunge in women's rights, and especially in child marriage.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cody. Now we're going to hear from panelist Gracie Wall.
Hello, I'm also a senior here at Florida State University, and I was wondering what you would say is the difference between child marriage or...
So that last bit fell out. A difference between child marriage and what?
I'm sorry, my headphones just said child marriage, early marriage, and forced marriage.
Child marriage is forced marriage, because I think a child just hasn't reached the age of consent. And again, I want to repeat that there's a difference. Some kids are really persuaded into and pushed gently, coerced very gently into an arrangement of marriage, and some girls are actually beaten. So in my view, I think there's very little difference between child marriage and forced marriage. Now, adults, grown women, can also be forced into marriage. So of course, there is that difference. And then early marriage is just a euphemism for child marriage if the child is under 18 years of age. But there are indeed young adults, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, 20-year-olds, who may just not be mature enough to enter into a marriage. And if, someone who's not a minor is persuaded into an arrangement because she doesn't have the means, because she's scared, maybe because she's been raped, all of that can be considered early marriage. And I would just confine early marriage to a situation where the person who's entering the marriage is just not mature enough, regardless of what their age is, not mature enough to take on a responsibility like that.
Thank you.
Hi, Ayaan. I actually had a question. Something that was brought up by one of your answers was conflict or crisis situations and how these circumstances exacerbate the rate at which girls are married at a younger age. Now, are we seeing anything or any trends go on, especially with COVID?
I think that's a very good question. I think what we are seeing in general is that with COVID, there have been a lot of negative unintended consequences, especially in the realm of domestic violence. And imagine if you're in lockdown and you're a family of 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and you're all cooped up. I think that parents, and especially in societies where the extended family has a lot to say, you will see a rise in child marriage. Just get them out of the house, let them get married. You also see, I don't want to use the word unwanted pregnancies, but pregnancies for which people are just not ready to have. And so, yeah, COVID has caused a lot of turmoil within millions of households across the world. And it isn't just, the disease itself and people dying of COVID, but it is, the economic consequences of the poorer you are, again, the plunge in women's rights, girls' rights, civil society, you see a spike in violence and unrest that again compromises the rights of girls and women. So yeah, COVID has been terrible.
A word that you keep mentioning is protection, and how families oftentimes view, whether they're right or wrong, but they oftentimes view child marriage as sort of the symptom and solution to circumstances that are going on. Would you say that the solution to change these mindsets is education?
I think on the one hand, it is education, but it's also a trust. It is winning the trust of the parents and, let's say, the religious community, that it is okay for this young girl to become an adult and that she is more empowered to choose her own way in life and get married when she's ready to get married, and get married to someone she actually wants and has chosen. And a marriage like that is more likely to succeed than a marriage where you get a minor and you force her into a situation. And I was just looking at the statistics where we find at our foundation that marriages entered into before the age of 18 have a 70 to 80% likelihood of ending in divorce. You're basically forcing a young person who is not ready for this huge responsibility that's called marriage. Absolutely not ready, doesn't have the skill set, is not mature enough. And so a marriage like that is likely, highly likely to end up broken. And then what happens to that child? She doesn't have the economic means to survive. If there are children in the marriage, I shudder to think of what their future is. Then you have to think about, do you think she could get the legal means to get a divorce? I mean, if you're under the age of 18, how do you find a lawyer? Make your way to a women's shelter. So it is just misery for all concerned when you force young people to do things they don't want to do, and especially to take on a huge responsibility like marriage.
Right. What is all these reasons are very true. What is the excuse of some lawmakers as to why they don't want to, close these loopholes that exist?
I think even from the lawmakers, it is a respect for these religious communities and minorities. And I think that's where we enter. We now live in this age where identity politics as an ideology is prevalent. And lots of minorities demand from the majority and from the government and from lawmakers that they respect their traditions and their religious observances and so on. And I think that's where they hide the child marriage thing into. So listening to Frida, who has been a victim of child marriage herself, the fact that she describes that this is taking place in Brooklyn, New York, that the rabbi and the synagogue and the extended family, they all know about this and they're all engaged in this. They also know that it's against the law, but that they continue to do it because and these people are not poor people. They're not living in a third world country. They're born and raised in America, but they're still observing these traditions of arranged and forced marriages. And I think a lot of it has to do with lawmakers respecting the tradition or religion in question and then looking away. And I think the loopholes give them an opportunity to just pretend there's nothing bad going on. You know, when you say parental consent, doesn't that sound very strange? It is the very same parents who are forcing the child into marriage. What do you mean by parental consent? It's not parental consent that's relevant here. It is the individual who is entering into the marriage's consent, and that individual is not of age and shouldn't be forced into marriage.
No, I agree with you completely. But something that I also wanted to elaborate on, or have you elaborate on, was the limitations. Can you please discuss a little bit the limitations that are placed on women, especially in this country, when they are married and let's say they're in an abusive relationship, whether it be physically abusive, mentally abusive, and how they can get out of that, or if they can't get out of it?
Well, I think the limitations speak for themselves, especially if you're a child. So, I mean, are you really going to stand up to this man who's stronger than you, more powerful than you, and who is conniving with your own family to keep you in that situation? So when you listen to these girls and women's stories, it's constant, I don't want to be with this man, I don't want to be in this marriage, I don't want to be in this situation, but almost all other choices are worse. So standing up to them, you invite abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse, financial abuse, sexual abuse. Being married means that this man has the right to rape you anytime he wants to, because it's marriage. That's not seen as rape. And then you get pregnant. When you get pregnant, you are then again you have these terrible choices. What are you going to do? Have the baby or have an abortion? You're not going to abort your own baby. And once children start to come, it becomes very, very difficult for women to leave these marriages. And I've seen a number of women who have done so successfully, have become single mothers, went ahead and educated themselves, and then found someone that they're happy with. But for most women, it ends in a bad place. And it ends in a bad place for their children.
Right. So thank you so much. And we're going to go back to panelist Cody Bias because he has a question.
I just had a follow-up to when you were talking about how like crises and breakdowns in government kind of like facilitates more child marriage. I was wondering if you expected that pattern to continue as recently with what's happened in Afghanistan.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I think the situation in Afghanistan is really dire. So in the 20 years that the United States was in Afghanistan, the girls and women of Afghanistan got a taste of what it was to lead dignified lives. A lot of them got an opportunity to go to school. And what we saw with the girls and women of Afghanistan is they did exceptionally well. I mean, really within that time span, you saw Afghan women as, anywhere from astronauts and economists and all the various professionals. They're in media and journalism, they're in fashion. They just did extremely well. And even as women leaders, and many of these women chose to stay inside Afghanistan and continue to educate and emancipate Afghan women. And then we had that just drastic withdrawal in August, and everything went downhill from there. These women are locked up again, they're banished from the public space, their jobs are taken away. And even in that context, what I see right now, because I follow that situation closely, is that a lot of the women are trying to continue their education. They're trying to educate the younger girls. They're trying to keep the flame of emancipation and freedom burning against all odds. So yeah, the breakdown of society almost immediately translates into the violation of the rights of girls and women, and of course of boys and men too. But for girls and women, it is major. It's major. Now, the opposite is also true, where you see in developing countries that girls are allowed to go to school, for instance, in urban areas, in big cities. You see more and more women doing better and better, joining the professions, starting businesses, big and small, and really thriving and doing very, very well. And then you go to the rural areas where tradition and religion is very strong. And the lifestyle and the life expectancy and the quality of life of those girls is radically different from, the city versus the rural areas. And so I think it is it's all of that. It's order, it's democracy, it's progress, and these are very slow steps, but worth taking.
And
Well, going off of that, I apologize, Cody, but going off of that, would you say in these places where there are civil wars, regional conflicts, that the individual status affects the rate at which a young girl is at risk of being married off? For instance, if she is an IDP, an internally displaced person due to that civil war.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, absolutely. So she is at higher risk of being, a girl is at higher risk of being sold by her own family. She is at higher risk of being forced into marriage with men who are much, much older for nothing. It's just entering into a life of slavery. At a much higher risk of human trafficking. I think trafficking is one topic we almost never talk about these days, but in every broken society, what you see are women, poor women, who are corralled into a life of exploitation, sexual exploitation and exploitation of their labor. So the more broken down a society is, the more order breaks down, even if it's just tribal order, right? Governmental order. And in these places, it's almost always all types of order that break down. It becomes terrible for women.
Right, thank you so much. And now we're going to go back to Cody Bias so we can finish his second question.
Sorry, Cody.
Oh, it's okay. Thank you. I was gonna say you have also touched upon how it's predominantly like religion and like tradition that fuels this practice. And I was wondering if you personally think religion is the dominant factor contributing to this, especially in say like more fundamentalist like Islamic countries like the Middle East and such.
Yes, I think religion does contribute to this factor. And if you look at very radical, fanatical, very, very orthodox religious communities, they do practice forced marriage. And that is the largest number of girls and women who find themselves in these types of communities are Muslim. But you also see that within the Jewish community and some Christian communities and Hindus and even Buddhists. So religion is used as a tool to justify marrying off children. And with that justification, you know, the parents, and especially the male guardian, feels that he is doing the right thing through his religious observance, the godly thing, the righteous thing, by forcing his child into marriage or arranging for a child to be married off. And so, yes, religion it's a big, big tool, and it's a huge factor in the endurance of this terrible practice against girls and women.
My one last question, I was going to say, where did you personally find the courage to escape that practice and like do something great with your life?
I think it wasn't a spark of the moment. I think, you know, just by watching my mother and the other women in my life when I was a young girl, and seeing how hopeless they were, how they didn't have any say over their own circumstances. To me, they felt, when I looked at them, I thought they're just powerless. They depend on men, and many of these men are gone. They can't take care of their children. They can't take care of themselves. And when I was in high school, I saw several of my classmates just not show up from one day to the next. And then a few years later, I would see them looking really motherly and with children and covered from head to toe. And they seemed just as desperate as the older women, like my mother and my grandmother. And I thought, I don't want that to happen to me. Now, I was very, very lucky. My father wasn't there with us when I was 14, 15 years old. When he came home, I was 22 years old. So that is when he arranged the marriage for me. And at the age of 22, I think I don't want to call myself sophisticated, but I was empowered enough. I felt empowered enough to get away. And so I think it's a combination of the circumstances. I had actually been to school, I could read and write, and I thought I could make something of my life. Somalia went into civil war, and a lot of Somalis were fleeing into Europe. And I observed how people who had just come from Somalia would go to Europe and ask for asylum. So I thought I can do that too. Especially since I had been translating for many of them in Kenya, I thought that's something I can accomplish. And so I think the combination of all that just gave me the opportunity to run away.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing. A person in the chat, Brianna Norris, wants to know specifically more about your story and your experience. She asks, how was someone, or how did you move on from these experiences and find love or steer away from these traditions?
I think that's a very, very important question. And at the AHA Foundation, when we get young women and young girls come and ask for help, the one thing I repeat is, I think you actually will be able, in America and in Europe, in most cases, you will be able to get away from a bad situation. You'll be able to get away from your family. We'll be able to help you find a new life. And I did that. So when I came to the Netherlands, the Dutch government provided for me shelter, food, healthcare, and sponsored me to go and get an education. And later on, when I went to college, I borrowed money, which I had to repay. But by then, I was confident enough that I could do that. So I think materially, it's possible to move on, and I moved on. What is really difficult is emotionally, because you find yourself very often missing your family. You find yourself in isolation, thinking, I don't belong here, or maybe even feelings of resentment, which are natural, feelings of anger towards the people who have forced you into that situation, also very, very natural. And so it's very important, I would say, once you get out and away and you get materially to stand on your own two feet, to look after yourself emotionally and not imprison yourself in resentment and in anger, but perhaps to seek therapy, talk to other people, make friends, and then live life on your terms. And I'm fortunate enough to be with a man of my own choice now, 2 children whom I love madly, and I'm leading now the life that I want to lead.
Thank you so much for sharing. Your story, I think, is one of hope and courage, especially for those women right now who are going through the experiences that you went through. And I think it's really beautiful that you're sharing and that you're going on this platform to speak out and to help those women and provide them the resources that weren't around when you were going through your journey. And Marielle, you're welcome. Marielle Patrick has a question.
So the question that I had, you essentially kind of asked or answered, I'm sorry, but it was more so kind of just answering. You mentioned how education is really important in keeping these women out of child marriages. And I was more so just going to inquire about what kinds of programs you think are effective in doing this, rather than they get into the program and then they somehow go back. Like, how do they stay out, essentially?
I think a program to ensure that an individual is rescued out of and goes on the path to a successful, fulfilling life is a program with 3 components. I think the first and the foremost is safety. How do you make sure that this girl is not captured or recaptured by the family, punished, beaten into submission, or worse, even killed? And we've seen all of that. So number 1 is safety. Number 2, I think in terms of education, there is the general education, which you need to go from A to B, but there's also vocational. So something tangible that this young woman can do to make money in a dignified way, right? And so that component where education is combined with a future outlook of earning money so that that individual can look after herself and doesn't have to rely for too long on help either from the government or from other people, or find herself in debt, which then again puts her in a situation that's just terrible. And then I think there is psychological help that is absolutely necessary, and mental health, where she has to deal with not being with her family anymore, having to deal with the trauma of being subjected to various types of abuse, but also feel strong enough to get on, develop friendships, and develop strong, healthy relationships. So any program with those three components, I think, has a high likelihood of leading to a successful escaping of a forced marriage.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our final question is from Mary Gogolishvili in the comments. Did you ever go back to your home country? And is the child marriage situation in Somalia still the same, or has it changed?
So I went back. I didn't go back to my home country. I didn't go back to Somalia after I was married off. But I did go back to Nairobi, Kenya, where my mother was after I was married off and ran away and was gone for 5 years. And I had demonstrated to my parents and the wider family that I was actually capable of looking after myself. One of the threats was, if you run away from a forced marriage, they don't call it a forced marriage. They say it's a marriage that your father has chosen for you. It's all, presented in this language of caring and protection. But if you were to leave that marriage, then terrible things would happen to you. You'd become a prostitute, you'd be exploited, and I could show them 5 years on that I wasn't exploited, that I was going to university, I was working as a translator, interpreter, I was earning money, I was actually financially contributing to my own mother, brother, helping them out. So I think in a roundabout way, I was able to show that I could thrive. Now, in Somalia, again, in the 1970s, 1980s, maybe even as far back as the 1960s, women had way more rights than after the breakdown of order. And two things happened in Somalia that compromised the rights of girls and women. One is the civil war itself, where there's just no one to fall back on, and all the guardrails of decency and human beings behaving in a good way towards one another broke down. But there was also the rise of radical Islamic fundamentalism in Somalia. And so with those two components, young girls as young as 8, 9 years old are forced into marriage, they're kidnapped, sexually exploited. And you see that in any place where there is civil war and a breakdown of order.
Thank you so much. A panelist previously asked in the chats, Ariana Hernandez said, you mentioned that 98% of these women are or of people married, its children are girls. Can you discuss how gender roles have played a role in forced marriages? More specifically, how young girls have been targeted to get married to older men and how this is normalized?
So on the second part, targeting younger girls for older men in these communities, in these societies, they tend to have more money than younger men. So most families would just really prefer that, their daughter marries a younger man, but often young men are poor, they don't have much. So girls as young as 8, 9, 10, 11, 14 years old are married off to men who either have been married before or who already have wives. And I have even seen a bride who was younger than the daughter of the man that she was married to. so there's just really bizarre situations that you see. Why is it so gendered? I think we've discussed this when Cody asked the question. Girls and women in many societies are viewed as property. They're also viewed as, when they become sexually active, as, oh my goodness, they're just going to bring shame upon the family. And so their sexuality is controlled through early marriage or forced marriage. Then I think we also get back into the religion and tradition arguments, where in religion, there's no specific age, for instance, in Islam, that a man should marry. But imams will tell you that as a father, you are blessed and the angels will smile down upon you if your daughter has her first period in her husband's house. And so there is this very specific age, 9 years old, age of when she has her first menstruation, she should be married off. And in a lot of traditions, they really do believe that. So that creates a situation where girls are, the largest percentage of forced marriages are to girls. Now you see young men, boys and men, also forced into marriage, but that's if the family finds out that the guy is homosexual. And so to cover up the shame of the family, they'll say, oh my goodness, let's marry him off as quickly as we can. And that is a lot of, is just total homophobia, disguised as coping with that situation. So they force these. And you can imagine the misery that comes out of that.
Ayaan, I would like to thank you once again so much for coming. And thank you so much for sharing and making an impact and really being the hope that for so many women, especially ones who are going through circumstances like this right now. And I would also like to thank the panelists and everyone for